Good evening. My name is Stephen Auffelt, and as the director of the McDevitt Center for Creativity and Innovation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our talk this evening by Matthew Ashley of the University of Notre Dame. Father Coyne will be introducing Dr. Ashley shortly. I just want to take a moment to do a little business with you. First, I want to welcome you to this inaugural lecture in our inaugural lecture for the spring semester in our ongoing series of lectures devoted to the general topic of science and religion in modern America. We will have two other talks this semester. The next upcoming talk is on March 14th, when we'll be hosting Robert John Russell, who will be speaking on the topic of cosmology and creation. That talk will happen in the Panache Chapel. And then on April 25th, Nancy Murphy will be delivering a lecture entitled Emergence, Systems, Organisms, Persons. There is a flyer that looks like this that is available at the entrance and exit. I encourage you to pick one up if you don't have it, that provides information about these upcoming lectures. I'd also like to invite you to follow the activities of the McDevitt Center on our blog, which is mcdevittcenter.com. If you go to it, you'll find information not only about what we're doing, upcoming events. You'll also find, right now we have, for example, a post linking you to other lectures by Dr. Ashley and to writings by him, so to help you develop your acquaintance with his work if you're not familiar with it. And we do that with each of our speakers. Finally, two little bits of business. After the talk, there will be a question and answer period, and then we invite you to continue conversation with some refreshments, which are just in the corner of the room over here. And lastly, let me encourage you to silence cell phones at this time. And if you are approaching the microphone for a question, please actually turn your cell phone off. The wireless mics pick up a lot of static if cell phones are on, even though they're silent. So with that, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Father George Coyne, the inaugural McDevitt Chair of Religious Philosophy, who will formally introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to you all. I know why you're here, certainly to hear Dr. Ashley, but also it's warm in here. It really is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Matt Ashley, who has been a close friend, if you don't mind, and a colleague since we jogged together in the Papal Gardens at Castel Gandolfo. He, as you may note, if you haven't already, just a few years younger than I am. I'm not going to waste a lot of precious time in repeating his biography to you. You already have access to it. I would only like to say that as a young college student, he dedicated himself to physics and engineering, inspired by his father. But he soon became fascinated with, of all things, theology. And so after completing his doctorate in theology at the University of Chicago Divinity School, he took on a position in the theology department at the University of Notre Dame, where he has been for the last 20 years, the last 3 of them as chairman of the Department of Theology. Upon my little probing, he mentioned that he has almost 80 persons who report to him as chairman of this theology department, a sizable department, which he refers to as an alligator pit. Sorry, Matt, but that goes back a long way. His reference for deans and chairmen of diverse departments as an alligator pit is not to be repeated outside this room, and certainly not to the University of Notre Dame. Matt has taught and researched in many areas, from liberation theology to Christian spirituality. And in recent years, he has devoted a lot of time to developing a center for the dialogue between science and theology, or religious experience. You may wonder why, in a lecture series here devoted to science and religion in modern America, we selected to have Matt speak on Jesuit spirituality and academic theology. I think the reason, if I may express it, is in a Jesuit college like our own here at Moyne, we should take this opportunity to set the science-theology dialogue against a wider perspective of the relationship of academe to Jesuit spirituality. Matt Ashley is uniquely prepared to do this for us, especially with his depth of knowledge of two great Jesuit theologians, Ignacio, Ellacuria, and Karl Rahner. Almost make Rahner Spanish. Matt, thanks very much for coming to us.
Thanks, George, for that very kind introduction. And I'm glad to know why you selected it too, because I sort of feel like the odd man out in the series, but I think you articulated pretty well what got me interested in this. I have become very interested specifically in the relationship between theology and spirituality, which are two sort of ways of thinking and talking about God that diverged in the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages. And it was a separation that was often bemoaned. One of my favorite university administrators that I think a lot about is a fellow named Jean Gerson, who was a kind of a wunderkind at the University of Paris. He flew through his studies, graduated in, I think, around 1394, and they made him chancellor of the university within 2 years. And the poor guy had a nervous breakdown, and he literally got out of town, and he wrote a letter back to his friends at the University of Paris saying why he quit. And he said, you know, in this job, I'm required to listen to boring sermons. I have to deal with the nobility, and they're a pain in the neck. I have to promote people of dubious moral character and of little intellectual gift. And the academic study gets in the way of my relationship to God. In many ways, the Jesuits were among a number of movements since then to try and bring back together the best of what Christian spirituality is about, and academic study in general and theology in particular. And so that's been something of great interest to me. The other reason why, at least I thought about how this might be interesting for the general topic, is something that I think about a lot at Notre Dame in dealing with my colleagues who are scientists in particular. what is the study of science at a Catholic university? I mean, does it make a difference to study science, say, at Notre Dame as opposed to the University of Michigan or downstate at the University of Indiana? Is there something internal about the study of science that is energized and energizes Christian faith? And I think that the Jesuits are a good sort of case study to look into this, because within just a couple of decades of the founding of the Jesuits, they were involved in all kinds of different stuff, including the study of science. And so what I tried to think about was, what is it about their spirituality that got them into so many diverse ministries, including the study of science, but other things like building churches, writing poems, literature, drama, music, and they all saw that as integral to this very simple but powerful insights that Ignatius of Loyola had. So that's kind of the general background, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, to sort of set the stage, of at least say a little bit about what I think Ignatian spirituality is about, using the spiritual exercises, and then look at these two figures from the last century. Very different, one born and raised in Germany, engaged in education there, the other one a Basque who moved to El Salvador when he was young, both of whom thought a lot about the university. So let me just jump in there with that little prelude, and I think I have about 50 minutes, and then I hope you'll stick around and ask some questions. One of the most significant moments in the life of Ignatius of Loyola came in the fall of 1523, when he was informed by the Franciscan officials who had jurisdiction in the Holy Land that he had to leave and go back to Europe. This decision left him in a quandary, since traveling to Jerusalem had dominated his imagination since his conversion experience 2 years earlier. His idea then was to be a kind of a knight for Christ. He would do the glorious things that the saints before him, like Francis and Dominic, had done. And where better a place to do that than in the land where Jesus himself taught, worked, suffered, died, entered into his glory. He'd gotten there after a lot of work. He felt that his success in getting there was some sign of divine approval. But now all of a sudden he was told that he had to leave. What would he do now? This question was on his mind as he journeyed back to Venice, and he came to a very momentous decision. He recounted it in his autobiographical musings, naming himself the Pilgrim in the following words. Quote, "After the Pilgrim realized that it was not God's will that he remain in Jerusalem, he continually pondered within himself what he ought to do. And eventually he was rather inclined to study for some time so he would be able to help souls. And so he decided to go to Barcelona." One chuckles at the stories of Ignatius, now well into his 30s, sitting on benches with young children to learn Latin. Later, he studied at the University of Alcalá in Salamanca in Spain, and finally at the University of Paris, where he got a Master of Arts degree, not a degree in theology, by the way, in 1535. When he and his first companions resolved to found a new religious order, and this resolve was confirmed by Paul IV in 1540, founding universities was not on their mind. It's not among the list of things that they said they were going to do. They did talk about educating young children and other simple persons, but they had more in mind of sort of catechesis. But yet, gradually over time, they gravitated toward it, and they sort of fell into running universities, beginning with the first Jesuit-staffed college to open its doors to lay persons in Messina, in Sicily, 1548. Yet it became so predominant among their ministries that this accidental character of the original commitment to universities become obscured, and many people think of the Jesuits as, oh, they run universities. So my sense is there must have been some kind of internal connection for Ignatius when he felt rather inclined to go to studies after his initial resolve was frustrated, and then from the enthusiastic way in which the Jesuits took on the running of universities. And those are the resonances that I would like to explore with you today. As I said before, I'll start with an initial survey of what I think Ignatian spirituality is about, but then look at these two figures, Karl Rahner, Ignacio Ellacuria, who in many ways thought about the challenges facing Catholic higher education in general in a modern world, quite different from Ignatius's world, and tried to think about how to go back to some of the original inspirations of Ignatian spirituality in order to meet those challenges. So I'm going to begin with a brief outline, focusing on Ignatius's masterpiece, The Spiritual Exercises. And I do so with apologies to some in this room who probably know the exercises very well. If you want to take a little nap now, that might be just fine. The spiritual exercises present a highly structured set of meditations, reflections, and rules. There it is. For, as he put it, preparing and disposing the soul to rid itself of its disordered affections, and then seeking and finding God's will in the ordering of our lives for the salvation of our souls. Karl Rahner thought that the exercises provide a method for navigating a kind of a gray area in the Christian life, which he thought was increasingly important in the modern era. He said that on the one hand, when we think about what we should do, there are a number of objective moral norms like thou shalt not kill, and there are precepts of the church, attendance at Sunday Mass. Whether or not to follow these requires no discernment, even though for some of them their precise application in particular cases can be complicated. On the other hand, Rahner wrote, there is a wide field of choices that are on the surface of things morally neutral, because both options are morally allowed, they're both good. Trivial ones, shall I have cornflakes or Rice Krispies for breakfast? But less trivially, what career will I choose for myself among a wide variety of options? How shall I invest my money? Will I get married or stay single? Yet what if, Rahner asks, in these areas in which both choices are morally good, God has a specific will for each of us, at least in some of these things? Then wouldn't these choices have a kind of a moral seriousness about them? But if that's true, and if, as the way I set it up, there aren't sort of universal laws that you can derive the answer from, then how do we figure out first whether some particular matter is of this sort? I mean, as a matter of fact, it might not really make difference whether you eat Raisin Bran or Rice Krispies for breakfast. Or it may be that in God's eyes, a particular choice of career is not that important. But maybe it is. So how do we figure that out? And secondly, if it is, how do we sort through what God might want us to do for that? And in Rahner's view, that's what the exercises are about. It's a way to make some kind of life-determining choice, something really important for what our future is going to be, when the options are both good, so that you can't just sort of read off from a set of laws what you should do. The exercises does this work in 4 stages, which are conventionally named weeks, even though they don't even necessarily or even usually consist in 7 days apiece. During the first week, Ignatius has the retreatant come to grips with the power of sin. Sin is a death-dealing reality that has the entire cosmos in its grips, and in which each individual, if he or she is honest, will realize that he or she is complicit. The point of these meditations on sin is not just to inculcate or even necessarily to inculcate guilt or shame, and certainly not hopelessness or despair, since along with these reflections on the presence and consequences of sin, God's loving response is already there, particularly in an imaginative scene toward the end of this first part of the exercises, in which one imagines oneself standing before Christ on the cross. This is God's response to sin. And Ignatius has one ask himself, how is it that the Creator has become human to die on a cross, and all this for me? And to ask of myself, what have I done for Christ? What am I doing for Christ? What ought I to do for Christ? Some of you may know that Ignacio Ellacuria, when he was given an honorary doctorate at Santa Clara University, used precisely this little Ignatian imaginative exercise to talk about a university's responsibility in today's world in an address he gave there in 1982. The outcome that Ignatius expects from this part of the retreat is that the person going through it will cry out in, quote, an exclamation of wonder, so not guilt and shame, wonder and surging emotion that we have not been left in the power of sin, and to engage in a conversation with God. Ignatius calls it a colloquy of mercy, in which we thank God for God's mercy and promise to amend our lives in the future. In other words, the first week is about this profound combination of a deep sense of the power of sin on the one hand, but also a deep joy and gratitude at God's presence despite sin on the other. And this is a good example of a point that Avery Dulles once made about the exercises, and that is that they're able to hold together polar opposites, which when academic theologians try to lay them out conceptually, we're not able to keep the balance. But because the exercises isn't a theology book, but a set of practices, they're able to do what the conceptual academic theologians are not able to do. But Ignatius thought this dual sense of the power of sin in the world, but also a deep sense of gratitude, was so important that if someone didn't get this, then they weren't supposed to continue on in the exercises. But they do form then the starting point for the second week, as it's called, in which we hear the call of Christ to join him in overcoming all that opposes him in the world, namely the sin that was just reflected on in the first week. And this is the point in the exercises where Ignatius expects that one will begin to use his rules for discernment to think about the kind of choice that I was talking about earlier. These rules for discernment have been the subject of a lot of scholarly study, which we won't go into tonight. For my purpose, I simply want to make one point about them. They weren't meant to be used in the abstract. Ignatius assumed that while the person making the retreat is in the process of making this choice and using these very complex rules, he or she is also engaged in the main contemplations of the second week, which are very imaginative, vivid portrayals of Jesus' life and ministry as they're found in the Gospels. Ignatius has one put all of one's imagination into portraying and fleshing out scenes from Scripture, indeed making oneself a part of them, to imagine oneself a part of the drama of salvation as it was worked out in the Holy Land 2,000 years ago. So, for example, in his contemplation on the Nativity, he's quite specific. He wants us to see, quote, see in the imagination the road from Nazareth to Bethlehem. How long is it? How broad is it? Is it level? Does it wind? In other words, he really wants you to get imaginatively into the picture. Similarly, he continues, look at the place of the cave of the Nativity. Is it big? Is it small? How low? How high? He has us put ourselves in the scene, imagining ourselves a poor little unworthy slave, looking upon Mary and Joseph, helping as best we can. We consider what Mary and Joseph do, this again on the Nativity, journeying and toiling in order that the Lord might be born in greatest poverty, and so that after many labors, hunger, thirst, heat, cold, injuries, insults, he may die on the cross. And all this for me. And then I will reflect and draw some spiritual profit. Spiritual profit. If one is walking with Jesus in this way, placing oneself imaginatively with Jesus in his work, then can this fail to have an impact on how I imagine my situation now and the options that I am considering? In other words, when I think about the second week, the content of the second week is this process of discernment and imaginative involvement in the life of Jesus. But I suggest that what Ignatius is after is a transformation of our imagination. Because as we transform our imagination, then the way that we imagine our future and the two ways that future might go will change. One of them, Ignatius thinks, will resonate in a certain way with this imaginative world that we inhabit with the Jesus of history, if I can use that loaded term. So in this way, working carefully through the meditations and weighing through this choice, Ignatius thinks that with the help of an experienced director, it will become clearer to me which of these two choices, each of which could be morally good in itself, is the one more in conformity with God's will. Now, on the third and fourth weeks, we continue to mull over the decision while following Jesus through to the conclusion of his work, his entry into the Paschal mystery, and then into his resurrection. The fourth week concludes with a contemplation to attain love, which for Ignatius does not mean attaining God's love for us. If we didn't have it, there was nothing we could do to get it. But we don't need it because God already loves us. It's the logic of the first letter of John, right? Not that we loved God, but that God first loved us. But in getting that sense and the generosity that it opens up, Ignatius's conviction is that the only place to make a good decision about my life is a position of gratitude and joy and peace, not one of guilt or trying to buy our way into God's love. A sense of always already having been loved and of having God present in my life, despite the reality of sin. This is the complexity of the exercises. For example, in that concluding exercise, he has us spend time reflecting on how God labors and works for me in all the creatures on the face of the earth. That is, God acts in the manner of one who is laboring. It's interesting the way Ignatius repeats himself. There it is. God acts in the manner of one who is laboring, which gives us a unique perspective on our life. And the response is the perhaps well-known prayer at the end of the exercises: "Take, Lord, receive all my liberty, all my memory, all I have and possess." I hope that even this brief outline of the exercises indicates my central point that I want to make, and that is the power of the imagination. That the imagination and what was called in the tradition the spiritual senses of grasping my life within a broader drama was really important for Ignatius. That it is in the imagination that I place myself with Christ, and it is in the imagination for Ignatius, when it's been transformed by this imaginative walking with Christ, that the choices before me light up in a certain way. Now, certainly for Ignatius, this means we need to root out some biases in advance, so these disordered attachments. But for him, the kind of the dynamite for breaking through that is gratitude. It's an overwhelming sense of joy at what God has been doing for me, and also a great sense of the favor God does me by asking me to be a part of what God is doing for others. But it also means a sense of liberating and opening that imagination. Now, my little segue here is that, particularly among the way that humanists, Renaissance humanists, thought about the university during the late Renaissance into Ignatius's time, this is what they thought the university was about. A liberal education was meant to liberate the mind. It was meant to broaden the imagination, to break up the ways our imagination had become calcified, ruling out certain options. And I think this is why the early Jesuits found it so natural to take up the work of the university. But also the way that they took up other elements of culture, because what is culture if not the imagination writ social? That culture is our social imagination. And I think that's why Jesuits found it a natural part of their spirituality to do things like composing music or literature or drama, designing and building churches. That all of these things were ways of liberating the imagination, because it's that liberated imagination that's able to imagine new possibilities and that is able to sort of move from this imaginative accompanying of Jesus as it's portrayed in Scripture, and how that accompaniment might look today. I also think, and I'll say at least something about the theme, is that to the extent that the new sciences of astronomy and physics were blowing open the imagination of Europe in the 16th century, that this was another field in which Jesuits felt a natural way of living out this spirituality. So I would suggest it's the pivotal role of imagination in Ignatius' spirituality that helps us make the connection between this work and university work. Well, now let me fast forward 400 years to a different kind of situation and talk about Karl Rahner, who lived from 1904 to 1984. He's known for his prolific writings and lectures. He doesn't spring to mind particularly as someone involved in university administration and reform, yet he did think and write about these things, partly because his brother Hugo was university president. Karl Rahner and Hugo Rahner returned to Innsbruck in around 1948, because when the Germans took over Austria in 1933, they shut down the Jesuit University in Innsbruck and they scattered the faculty all over Europe. Rahner ended up actually going to Vienna. And so they came back to reconstitute the university in 1948. And particularly if you read Karl's older brother Hugo, Hugo was involved in thinking about what should this curriculum look like now in a changed situation in the post-war years. Rahner also thought and wrote explicitly about how the formation and education of seminarians needed to be revised. And I think looking at that gives us some sense, mutatis mutandis, of how he looked at university education. In several essays that he wrote in the late 50s and early 60s, Rahner observed that the young men coming to the seminary then were different from the generation that entered with him in the early 20s. He often pointed to his own upbringing in a small Catholic town in southwest Germany, and the sense of a kind of a homogeneous and all-encompassing Catholic culture that you just sort of kind of absorbed the Catholic faith by just living there, and that there was a kind of a sense that you got growing up that the whole of Catholic faith and practice just kind of held together and made sense. He thought this kind of initial sense coming into studies, that it holds together, it makes sense, it's important, was more missing among the young men coming to him in the 50s and 60s because that Catholic culture was gone. In other words, he was reflecting on the phenomenon of secularization in Europe. Well, where could you get this then? Well, he said that given the ever-intensifying specialization, not just in theology, but every field, right, becomes increasingly specialized, and the growing jungle of technical data and argument that surrounds even the simplest conclusion in scripture studies, in theology, ethics, Rahner didn't think it was possible to sort of piece by piece build up a proof of Christian faith from below, because it would take about 3 lifetimes. So he thought that there had to be a kind of an initial overview of the Christian faith, what he called a first level of reflection. But he also asserted that there could and should be some kind of initial sense of God's presence in the world that could help one make sense of, that kind of energize from within Catholic doctrines and practice. This is behind a saying that is sometimes quoted, which I have down in, there he is. He said toward the end of his life, the Christian of the future will be a mystic, or there won't be any Christians anymore. Now, he didn't mean by that Christians would have ecstatic mystical visions or the experience, kind of the annihilation of the ego or things like that. I think he had a very prosaic sense that they would have a deep internalized sense of God's presence that could stand in the place, if you will, of the kind of culturally communicated sense of God's presence that was more the rule when he was growing up, but then in a secularized Europe just wasn't the reality anymore. Now, in fact, I think what he actually had in mind, and he gives some hints along the way, was something like the vision that Ignatius reported on the banks of the river Kardener, which was toward the end of his time in Manresa, where, as he put it, God taught him individually as a school teacher teaches a student. Ignatius said, rather controversially for some, that even if Scripture had never been authoritatively revealed, on the basis of that vision, he would have belief in all the truths of the faith. Now, of course, Ignatius knew quite well that Scripture had been revealed, and he wasn't saying that then Scripture became sort of disposable. But I think his idea was that because of that vision, he had a sense from the inside of the power of God's presence that is then expressed in detail in Scripture and tradition. This underlying conviction that Rahner talks about in saying the Christian of the future will be a mystic doesn't replace academics, any kind of study, but it motivates them and gives them a sense of coherence from the beginning that they would not otherwise have. In a very late essay that Rahner wrote, he continued in this same vein. He wrote an introduction to a pictorial biography of Ignatius, and he took a rather artificial device of pretending he was Ignatius writing a speech to Jesuits today. There he has Ignatius insists that the core of Ignatian spirituality is this experience of God and helping others to find that experience as well. So Rahner has Ignatius say the following to the, this would have been 1980, I think 1980, 1979, 1980 is when he wrote this. So this is supposed to be Ignatius speaking. Do you understand me now when I say that the chief task, the one which all the others are centered, would have to be for you Jesuits, the giving of the spiritual exercises? Now, I don't mean by that all of you have to do it or that all of you are necessarily any good at doing it. Some are and some aren't. I don't mean to devalue the other pastoral, academic, social, political work which in the course of your history you have believed yourselves obligated to take up. Yet all of these other things really ought to be understood by you as a preparation or a consequence of this most important task, which will continue to be yours in the future, helping people toward an immediate experience of God in which it dawns on them that the inconceivable mystery that we call God is near to us, that this mystery can be addressed by us, and that we only find salvation when we do not try to control God, but give ourselves over to God. You ought to be continually testing everything you do according to whether it serves this goal. If it does, then even a biologist among you may spend his time investigating the psychology of a cockroach. Kind of an interesting line there. I don't know if he had biologist friends or not. In other words, all the different kinds of academic endeavors, no matter how secular they might seem, could have meaning. Well, what does that have to do with the university? To do that, I want to take a look at one other essay by Rahner. And actually, this is a very early one, called The Ignatian Mysticism of Joy in the World. In that essay, Rahner explores what he sees as a central paradox of Ignatian spirituality. That on the one hand, Ignatian spirituality involves the most determined detachment from the world, articulated in the ideal of indifference. On the other hand, the most passionate involvement in the world, and that the two don't contradict one another but feed one another. This is expressed, as I said, in the Ignatian definition of indifference, which is a key spiritual disposition for him. As he puts it, not to prefer wealth over poverty, health over sickness, a long life over a short life. All the different ways that we might assign value to the world for Ignatian spirituality are ultimately relative. And that's because God is so absolutely transcendent over the world. Nothing in the world of its own mirrors God, because God is absolutely transcendent with respect to the world. So the world is other from God. And so there's almost a kind of a dizzying relativism in Ignatian spirituality. The world confronts us with its givenness, no one part of it intrinsically more sacred or holy than the other. This had been, in other words, it's a secularized world, a world that Christian thinkers like Pascal, Kierkegaard, and later Christian and non-Christian existentialists talked about. It's also a world of nature that makes nature seem to be just stuff for us to use for our own purposes. Those of you who think about ecology and environment, there's a famous essay by Lynn White, a medieval historian from 1967, when he basically blames our ecological mess on Christianity, which has a sort of a cosmic vacuum cleaner that sucks all the holiness out of nature and puts it in God. It's also the world that atheists like Richard Dawkins thinks that science just absolutely presses upon us that makes any belief in God absurd. But Rahner says this is only half of the picture, because the other side of Ignatian spirituality, because it is a Christian spirituality, after all, is that this God who is veiled in mystery beyond the control and grasp of human reason has in love chosen to enter our world. This is the truth of the Incarnation, which we celebrated 6.5 weeks ago at Christmas. God does choose to become present in the world, not because of any intrinsic holiness of the part of the world, but just because of the love and graciousness of God who chooses to be found there. So the other side of the coin from indifference in Ignatian spirituality and a sort of a distancing from the world is a sense that God can be found anywhere. So finding God in all things. So with this transformation, the world becomes, in the words of one of my favorite poets, Jesuit Gerard Manley Hopkins, charged with the grandeur of God. It's this twofold paradox that Rahner says in this early essay defines the Ignatian mysticism of joy in the world. And by breaking through to this real, or actually we don't break through to it because it comes by grace, by being carried through to it, it requires work on our part, and this is another way of looking at what the spiritual exercise is about. The linchpin, again, for Rahner is that the particular place where God lovingly chooses for us to find God is different for different people. And the process of discernment is that place where we find where God calls us and calls us to enter into the work that God is up to in the world. So what does a university do for this? Well, I think one of the things a university does is what any good university should do. It should expose us to the world in all its complexity, in all of its refusal, the world, both the natural world, the social world, the cultural world, to fit in with what we think about it. The world's surprising character. It's continually upsetting the order that we think should be found in it. In other words, a university should not be a place for the faint-hearted. It should be a place that shakes us up, that shocks us, that presents a universe far stranger and even more secular, I think, even than Richard Dawkins can imagine. Because that represents the sense of the world as a different place. But that then makes it possible in this incredibly diverse world that always upsets our preconceptions to find God in surprising ways. As Ignatius says in this contemplation to attain the love of God. Again, this requires a broadening of the imagination, but that's what the university is about. Exposing us to a world that is both incredibly surprising, a world in which where we expect to find God, God is not there, but then God surprises us by being found in other places. With that, I'd like to turn to my second figure, Ignacio Ellacuria, who worked in a very different context but had similar conclusions. Ellacuria was born in the Basque regions of northeast Spain, East Spain, in 1930. You never tell a Basque he's a Spaniard, by the way. I made that mistake once with one of my co-students at the University of Chicago. Unlike Karl Rahner, he was very much involved in administration. In his case, the Jesuit University in the capital of El Salvador, San Salvador, University of Central America, San Simeon Cañas, or the UCA for short. This university was founded in the late 60s. It was funded in part by wealthy families in El Salvador who thought that the national university had become overrun with Marxists and wanted a solid university. They must have been dismayed by the changes that the Jesuits made in the 70s in the light of the declarations of the Latin American bishops at Medellin in 1968. Ellacuria was on the governing board of the university there from 1974 on, and he was the rector of the university from 1979 to 1989. In November, he, along with 7 others, was murdered by a battalion in the Salvadoran army. Ellacuria was passionate about the need for the university to change to fit the situation there. But he also thought that he argued for this on the basis of the spirituality of the exercises. The way that he did this is evident from a meeting that the Jesuits of what was then called the Vice Province of Central America had in 1969, in which they were mulling over what changes they needed to make in the light of the bishop's call at Medellin and also a call of the Latin American provincials for the Jesuits to reevaluate all their works in Latin America. And Ellacuria actually used the structure of the exercises to make his case and talked about something like a corporate incorporation of the spirituality of the exercises. He said to his fellow Jesuits, "We seem to think we know what it means for an individual to follow the spirit of the exercises, entering into the different meditations. Following these meditations of Ignatius, we think we know what we're meaning as individuals when we ask to endure poverty, insult, humiliation. But what about our works?" He was thinking of their institutions. "Think of those that are most well known and take up most of our energies, our high schools, our universities. Can they be configured by the same spirit?" It's a decisive question. Well, he had an answer for the question. The answer for the question was, yes, there can be something like. He said there is something like an Ignatian institution. The institutions ought to be an efficacious sign, he's using sacramental language there, of the Christ experienced in the spiritual exercises. The Christ experienced in the exercises in the historical situation in which we live. So what did he think that was? Well, I think there's an easy way to get a brief sense of what Ellacuria thought about Ignatian spirituality from an essay that he wrote in 1986 on Pedro Arrupe, who was the superior general of the Jesuits from 1965 to 1983. For some of those years, Ellacuria was in charge of the formation of young Jesuits, and he and Arrupe, they were two Basques, and watching Basques argue is quite a unique experience. They disagreed fiercely, but they came to really have a deep respect for one another, and Ellacuria came more and more to see Arrupe as a unique figure, giving us Jesuits a sense of what Ignatian spirituality should be like in the 20th century. So I want to read you this quote that Ellacuria wrote about Arrupe. It's rather long, but it's a beautiful one, and I think it gives you a sense of what Ellacuria thought Ignatian spirituality was about. Arrupe, Ellacuria wrote, was a man of God, and he wanted Jesuits really to be men of God. This really means that it was God that Arrupe sought, and not anything else that might be passed off by God, even in religious and ecclesial environs. He never put anything in God's place. A God that is greater than human beings, a God greater than the constitutions and the historical structures of the Society of Jesus, a God greater than the church and all of its hierarchies, a God who is always greater and always new, semper maior et semper novus, who is always the same but never repeats, who has to be talked about in terms of dogmatic formulas but is never exhausted by them, a God who cannot be predicted in advance and nor manipulated. It was in the everyday experience of this God, in search of whom Arrupe spent many hours of prayer, that Arrupe's great freedom of spirit was aroused. His love, his capacious love for everyone, his constant availability to others, his humility, and also his remarkable instincts as a religious. This experience of God was, on the one hand, a strictly Trinitarian one, just as was St. Ignatius's. But without ever ceasing to be this, it was also a Christological experience. connected to the experience that Jesus experienced in the spiritual exercises. He's thinking about that second week that I talked about. A man of God, a follower of Jesus, who did not rule out other ways in which God could be found, but always knew how to subordinate them to the finding of God. I want to focus here just on two parts of that beautiful speech. What did he mean by talking about Ignatius's, Rupe's, experience of Jesus as a Trinitarian one, and then the Christological experience? And to give you a sense of the Trinitarian one, I actually have a little handout, which I sent around, which I marked up. And it's actually one of the meditations in the spiritual exercises. It's the one that starts the so-called second week. Remember, the second week is when you're really beginning to think seriously about a decision. So in many ways, this exercise, which is about the incarnation, frames the rest. And the reason why I give it to you is that Ellacuria wrote elsewhere about the Trinitarian nature. He wrote it in an essay when he was getting ready to go to the meeting of Jesuits held in 1983, the 33rd General Congregation, for those of you who are Jesuits here. And he wrote, I mean, the guy never had an unwritten thought, right? So, I mean, all of the stuff was found after his death. And he wrote an essay sort of mulling over what he wanted to say. He was elected to be a delegate. And in thinking it over, and looking ahead at this meeting, which among other things, they needed to elect a successor to Pedro Rupe, he said that what the Society of Jesus needed to do to think about how to move forward was to enter into the contemplation on the incarnation and to observe how the three divine persons see the world. Elsewhere, he called this seeing the world with Trinitarian eyes. And he said that seeing the world as Trinitarian eyes means seeing individuals and their histories and all their specificity, but also seeing from a global perspective, which particularly from the third world is one in which historical and social processes show up that make up a social sin because they result of behaviors that are objectively sinful and they cause a basis of injustice. And they negate the will and presence of God among men and women. Now, to get a sense of that, I wanted to take a look at this meditation because it's really a beautiful meditation, but it's a very powerful one in the way that Ignatius puts together what I would call a global perspective. It's worth remembering that Ignatius lived at a sort of first globalization. His brother was a conquistador in Mexico. During his lifetime later, he sent Jesuits all around the world. A global world was showing up and impinging on the European imagination as never before. But also an attention to the specific events, unrepeatable events of Jesus, but also my own particular circumstances. So what I tried to do in this handout was to mark it up a little bit to see how closely Ignatius pulls together a global perspective, the precise perspective of the events of salvation in Jesus, and my own situation. And it's the ability to pull those together that Ellacuria thinks about as seeing the world with Trinitarian eyes. So, for example, I'm finding my place. Now I'm the one that got stuck. Here we are. If you look at the way you're supposed to imagine the place, this is in the little number 102. Here I see the three divine persons, so here you have the Trinitarian perspective, gazing on the whole world, full of people, and how seeing that they were all going down into hell, they, the persons of the Trinity, decide that the second person should become a human being. So here you have this Trinitarian view on the whole world, and then they sent the angel Gabriel to Our Lady. You see the place, he says. So remember the importance of the imagination for Ignatius. The great extent and circuit of the world with peoples many and diverse. So this is in number 103. And then see in particular, and notice how specific he is, the house and rooms of Our Lady in the city of Nazareth. Oh, by the way, it's in the province of Galilee. I mean, he nails it down right one particular small place. So we go from The Trinitarian view, the whole globe, a very specific time and place. And the whole meditation moves around between those three. And then I'm supposed to draw profit from what I see. So I bring it back to myself in my own situation. The globalized world is seen with Trinitarian eyes. What do people do? What do they say? And we look at the world, and Ignatius says we see deception. We see violence. We see hatred. This is what he means by seeing the world dying and going down to hell. We see the Trinitarian response, a response of compassion. And then we see a very particular place, Gabriel and Mary doing their parts. Now, one consequence that Ellacuria draws from this is that seeing the world with Trinitarian eyes is to see that when we think about how to put together secular and so-called religious tasks, he doesn't draw upon a sort of a familiar one in the history of Catholic universities, which is nature and grace, right? I mean, one way to think about universities is the old Catholic dictum that grace builds on nature. Universities help us build on nature, understand nature so it sort of makes the first floor, and then we're ready for the second floor. So we have nature, grace, reason, faith. Ellacuria doesn't deny that those might be significant, but from this meditation and seeing the world with Trinitarian eyes, he thinks that a way to see the divine response to the world is to see that, quote, God does not repent of having created a world in which this terrible state of affairs has become possible. But God has an immense desire to save the human race, especially those so harshly punished by history. Ellacuria goes on in his essay, the Society of Jesus must see the world from this Trinitarian perspective. A perspective that does not see distinctions between the religious and the profane, so religious tasks and secular ones, but sees that the whole world and everything in it is God's creation, and the whole world and everything in it ought to be saved. This fundamental distinction is between good and evil, grace and sin, life and death. For this, according to Ellacuria, thinking about his own work as a university administrator, the university has an essential role to play. Once again, the contemplation on the Incarnation is an immense and demanding act of imagination, or reimagination, and it gains power to the degree that we are able to imagine in all concrete details the complexity and interrelationships of our world. As Ignatius wrote almost 500 years ago now, the great extent and circle of the world, with people so many and diverse. No place is better situated to do this than a university with its different departments in the sciences, both the natural sciences, the social sciences, economics, politics, but also the humanities and the arts, with their ways of helping us understand the many symbolic ways that human beings through history and around the world try to express and interpret both the beauty and the dilemma of human life. And how better to participate in God's desire to make a difference, to work the redemption of this world, than in different professional schools, Ellacuria wrote, thinking of schools of law or medicine, engineering, architecture, agriculture. So the university is very important for Ellacuria, but there's a price for it. He thinks that we need to rethink a sort of a traditional emphasis on objectivity in academic work. The thing that the whole glue that holds together the contemplation on this Trinitarian view of the world is compassion and a desire to make a difference in the world. It's the Trinitarian desire to enter into the world and work its redemption that holds the whole thing together. So, for this reason, an understanding of the university that sees the university as fundamentally detached, an objective observer from the outside, at least on Ellacuria's view, is a false one. So Ellacuria insisted at the Jesuit University in San Salvador that the work that it did to reach out to the surrounding society was not kind of some sort of side work to the real academic work which was going on inside the university, but that the outreach to the world outside the university was the precise way that the university made a difference as an academic institution. Right? Just speaking of my own institution, we have a lot of parts of the University of Notre Dame that send students out on volunteer work or that try and do, pro bono legal work, that work on migration. But often this is called the mission of the university, but then the academic work of the university is something different. And that kind of distinction is something that Ellacuria thought was really false, and a way that the university had to be rethought. Finally, a few words on what he means by the Christological character. When he spoke to his fellow Jesuits in 1969, he said that the experience of the spiritual exercises gives us a very precisely defined Christ. It is a Christ of the second standard and the third degree of humility. I'll just talk about the second standard. There's a meditation, again, very early in the second week, in which one imagines, again, a very powerful imaginative exercise. One imagines Lucifer, whom Ignatius often denotes as the enemy of our human nature, and Christ. Both of them seek followers, but they have diametrically opposed strategies for gaining followers and training them. For Ellacuria, this meditation presents, as he puts it, two different interpretations of human existence, both of which want to put themselves forward as an ultimate religious interpretation of what history is and what it means to be saved in history. As Ignatius's meditation invites us to imagine it, those who are dominated by the standard of the enemy of all things human, this is the proposal that is made. They are proposed to set up snares and chains to tempt people to covet riches so they may come to vain honor and finally to surging pride. Christ, on the other hand, recommends to his followers that they aid persons, attracting them to the most perfect spiritual poverty, and if divine majesty should be served, even to a degree of actual poverty, and by attracting them to a desire for reproaches and contempt, since from these come humility. In his 1969 address, Ellacuria expressed the worry that however much the individuals in them thought in these terms, he wondered whether the institutions of the vice province were not organized according to the standard of the enemy of our human nature. He called this an extremely grave problem. Now, okay, let's be honest here. I come from probably one of the wealthiest, most powerful universities, Catholic universities in the United States, if not the world. But I also find myself worrying about it. When we pore over the U.S. News and World Report rankings and we advertise where we are, or try to think about how we're going to get into the American Association of Universities. Which standard are we following as an institution? And that was the challenge that Ellacuria thought was facing Jesuit, but I would say all Catholic institutions. Now, of course, the point is not that universities should not have resources. They can't do what they do without resources. They should not have an esteem appropriate to their accomplishments. But Ellacuria insisted that when we seek these in isolation from a broader vision, the one that he defines in terms of seeing the world with Trinitarian eyes, then we're following an ultimately destructive logic that betrays the Catholic character of our universities. But Ellacuria also said universities can be places in which men and women are. And Ignatius's language, notice how precise it is. Set up snares, tempt, confuse. Instead, attract people. To attract them, to persuade them about another set of visions, another set of values, a different way to structure our life together. And a university at its best can be a place like that, right? That what we aspire the university to be is not a place where we indoctrinate students, except that when they're in my class, then they're supposed to just believe what I say. That is to set up snares and chains, but expanding their imagination and attract them to a different kind of vision, And how many institutions are there left in our culture today that do that? So yes, Ellacuria had very grim things to say, but he also thought that a university can and should incarnate that second vision, attracting people to a different way of thinking about our life together. This is why Ellacuria insisted that however much the university in El Salvador got involved in the political debates, and remember it was a time of terrible violence and civil war. He was president of the university when Oscar Romero was killed. But he always insisted that the university enter into the political fray in what he called in a university way. And the university way for him was the way of persuasion and attraction. Finally, just a few words on consolation. I know I'm gone just about 50 minutes, so give me a few more minutes because I think there is one final point. Here I want to use an essay by John O'Malley, a wonderful Jesuit historian, who anything I know of value of early Jesuit spirituality I got from reading his book. But O'Malley insisted that for the first Jesuits, consolation was the central goal for what they did. He wrote, quote, "In all of their manners of proceeding, their way of helping souls was to listen intently to the movements of consolation and desolation among those they sought to help, and to instill in those persons discernment and courage to follow what the Creator and Lord in person communicates to them." And if that was going on in their institutions, O'Malley says, all was well. This brings me back around to the issue we looked at with Karl Rahner, the experience of God. Or being a contemplative in action. This ideal, even though contemplative in action is never used anywhere in the spiritual exercises, it's traditionally associated with that final exercise in the spiritual exercises, the contemplation to attain love. We saw that for Rahner, Ignatian spirituality maps out the possibility to experience God in our secularized world. And Ellacuria joins him in emphasizing that a person's not be overwhelmed by the suffering and injustice found in our modern world, but find God present even there. In his concluding comments on this exercise in the spiritual contemplation, he talks about the contemplation to attain love as talking about the real possibility of encountering God in creation and getting creation back, retrieving it as a place in which God is present. Despite the power of sin, with which the one who does the exercises is familiar from the first week, God is still present in this world. The power of the resurrection brings us to the reality that God can be found. Although the way to do this is this active love that he recommends in the exercises. A love, he writes, that ought to show itself more in actions than in words. A love, he writes, in which the one who loves gives to the beloved what he or she has, and then the beloved in turn does the same. It's this exchange of gifts that has been the point of the exercises. And because of, Ellacuria says that the church, the people of God, are gathered together to continue this work in ever-changing historical situations, which can, as he puts it, once again make our world a home for God and a home for human beings. For Ellacuria, this is an action which brings us into God's presence, an event of union with God. And he has a wonderful little phrase, which I'm going to give you in the English, although then you have to look at the Spanish to figure it out because it's just so powerful the way he does it. So with apologies, I'm going to do a little Spanish language lesson. It's typically Ignatian prose, Ellacurean prose, where God becomes present to the person acting, and the person makes God present, makes him or herself present to the God who is acting. Ellacuria is not an easy guy to read. But it makes a little bit more sense in the Spanish. There it is. There's the Spanish, for those of you who know Spanish. And the key there is that Ellacuria uses this verb hacer in different forms. And what you can't get into the English is that the verb hacer in Spanish can mean to do, to make, to create, to enact. And so the way that Ellacuria does it in the Spanish is by linking all these things together into one whole, using this verb. So that his idea of contemplation and action, also it can be used for become. So God becomes or makes himself present to the person acting. So that what this whole thing of contemplation is full of is this notion of activity, of working. Remember in the exercises, God is someone who's laboring in creation, and in the sense of hard labor. And then the person makes God present. And then in the midst of all of that, it makes God present to others by helping others enter into this same dynamic. And then the third one, and in doing that, the person becomes present to the God who is acting. So it's all together. There's a God who's at work in the world, and the work of discernment, according to Ellacuria, is the work of finding that particular place where God is active, where God invites us to be active as well. And in doing that, God makes himself present to us in that particular work. And then we make God present to the world by being a part of that, to others. And in doing that, we become, because hacerse can mean to become, present to God who is acting. And that's all one thing. And it's a very deep way, according to Ellacuria, that we experience God. It's contemplation in action. And for Ellacuria, this enlivening activity in the world for Ellacuria is what Ignatius had in mind in this notion of consolation. A sense of hope, even in a world that seems to defy hope. To make God present in the world, according to Ellacuria, is to make a world a place where other people can find it more natural to hope and to act. And then they become present to God by acting in this way. So it's a wonderful positive feedback loop. And institutions can help this happen. And for Ellacuria, this is what the university in El Salvador was supposed to do. In a desperate situation, give people the hope to continue to act. Not in a sort of naive, Pollyannish way that ignores the suffering in the world, but that precisely moves into it to find God present even there. Okay, I've covered a lot of ground, and we'll have time, I hope, for questions. But let me just close up with a few points. I focus a lot on the imagination because I think the imagination is central to Ignatian spirituality. And I've suggested that Ignatius's early sort of attraction, being rather inclined to studies, was a sense that entering into that world would enable him to enliven the imaginations of others. I've also suggested that in the modern age, the university can present to us this globalized world, and if we're willing to see it through Trinitarian eyes. But that requires all of the faculties of the university. So that even though Rahner's sort of dismissive remark about discussing the psychology of cockroaches makes sense in this broader vision. That universities are places where we bring together a realism about the power of sin with a conviction that God is present in that world, and that the way that we find that God present is to be equally present in that world. And that universities give us many ways to do this. So I don't think it's an accident then that two Jesuits working in very different contexts, profoundly secularized Europe in the 50s into the 60s, and a society riven by injustice and violence in Central America in the 1970s and 80s, recovered this Ignatian fascination with the university. And found in the spiritual exercises a way to renovate that and to make it, to energize university activity in the modern world. Neither of them idealized what they were doing. Universities are still very complex. There was a reference, I know that as a department chair. There are many very difficult negotiations that have to be made between competing demands. And so a lot of what I've said here may sound very abstract. But I do think, looking over the scope of Jesuit involvement in universities, that it has provided an inspiring vision that has kept universities, Jesuit universities, a vital part of the cultures of, well, now all over the world, because they're all over the world. And I hope that happens here some. And even though I don't come from a Jesuit university, I do think Jesuits are Catholic at the end of the day. And that there's much to be learned from this vision and different ways that it can be enacted at Franciscan universities and Dominican and so on. So I thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions. All right.
Matt, thank you very much. I'll make just a brief remark. I've made the spiritual exercises as a Jesuit 2 times in my life for 30 days. You know what that's all about. I think it's the first time I've made the spiritual exercises in 50 minutes. Matt, thank you, to we Jesuits and to those who are associated with us as Jesuits. This has been a magnificent presentation to us, I think. So, it's open for discussion, even among Jesuit novices who have just returned from their 30-day retreat. So please, it is open for discussion. Don't come up with your cell phone turned on or so. Microphone here and a microphone there. So really, let's have an open discussion.
Yeah, and if I had known that there would be people here who had, I think I would have, really gotten stuck at Atlanta before and said, George, you'll have to do it without me. But
yeah. Please.
You mentioned Notre Dame's primacy within the Catholic educational system, and that it is, in fact, a university is constantly trying to strive to raise itself to different standards. And my alma mater, Fordham, certainly tries to do that. Georgetown tries to do that. Jesuit universities all try to do that. And looking at the kind of Ellacuria's kind of dual ways of looking at this, how does a university effectively balance its desire to raise itself in the rankings, and thus, like at Notre Dame, create something like the ACE program, which it's able to do because of its notoriety, which does a tremendous amount of good, but at the same time, really make that mission and tie that mission to academics in a way that really U.S. News and World Report rankings become frivolous or just meaningless in another sense.
boy, if you figure that out, let me know. And, I say this with all sympathy, as I said, a department chair goes and complains that I don't get enough faculty lines and there are never enough resources, and then it's hypocritical me in the extreme then to criticize those who are working in the university in the Office of Development and so on, who just do amazing work to try and make resources available for my faculty, and I'm sure the same is here, to just do amazing things. And so, it can be taken as sort of a cynical buy-off line. I mean, I think one of the points that I think really significant that, and this was something that Ellacuria really insisted on at the Jesuit University in San Salvador, is that we don't make a division between, academic standards and what is sometimes called the outreach of the university or the mission, but that we see that that having that kind of mission is itself both energizes and requires the highest academic rigor. I mean, some of the things that Ellacuria did with other Jesuits, I mean, it just wasn't him. There was a guy there named Ignacio Martin Baró, who went to my alma mater, University of Chicago, got a degree in social psychology, and he worked together with the political science department, and they basically said something like this. They said, well, we claim that we speak for the poor, but how do we know? But that brought a lot of problems because there were, as there are in the world today, there are big refugee populations. And how do you do a survey if people are always moving around? You can tell I'm not a social scientist because I'm putting this really badly. But basically, Martin Barreau, they founded an institute, and they came up with methods for dealing in political science and sociology in trying to do these kind of polls that dealt with this situation. Now, my point is that was a very a difficult academic problem. It engaged a lot of energy. They set up a center to do it. But it was involved with a very concrete problem in terms of the situation there. So Ellacuria didn't make a distinction between the way the university reached out and made a difference in the broader society. And that, I think, is really key. U.S. News will report, I mean, you can look at different kinds of things, and we say we don't pay attention to it, but then when it comes out, it's particularly if we moved up, it's all over the homepage. And so, and I think it's absolutely true, as I said, if universities are going to make a difference, they need resources. And if they do good work, they ought to be esteemed for the good work that they do. So I don't think it's necessarily that, but I do think that if it just becomes a drive for that, and you forget about perhaps that other logic that's presented in the standard of Christ, that is, what we're really about is attracting people to a different vision of the way the world can be and energizing them, then all of the other stuff really does then become counterproductive and destructive. So I know that wasn't an answer on how to negotiate in the details, but I do think that sort of, for me, the most important thing is seeing that the outreach of the university, a thing like the ACE program, is not kind of a sideshow, which is what can sometimes happen, but that it's really an integral part of the academic work of the university.
Would others like to, please?
Thank you very much. Appreciated it. I had the wonderful opportunity in Venezuela in the mid-'80s to travel with a Jesuit who was at the university there, Alberto Micheo, who was a Basque. And he was probably one of the best teachers. I didn't have him as a university professor, but I went out with him as he organized laborers in the cafetales in Venezuela for a week. And we discussed more Rahner than I had discussed ever in the seminary, and he also obviously was aware of the struggles in Salvador at the time, and it was just before the deaths of the Jesuits. But what I thought that Micheo did so well, in addition to what you said, was to bring in that struggle of liberation theology and integrate it in a way with the sense of contemplation, organization, the God in action, se hace presente kind of sense. I don't remember him using that phrase, but that kind of sense of making God present in the action of the people. And that's what I took from both his interpretation of Rahner and his interpretation, I suppose, of Ignatius. It was a wonderful gift.
Yeah, well, Ellacuria actually studied under Rahner in Innsbruck in the late 50s. I mean, he could be a kind of a prickly guy. Their nickname for him in Innsbruck was the Sun King. And he had sort of strong views. But he said of all the theologians at Innsbruck, the one that most influenced him was Rahner, and particularly this notion of the way that Rahner put it, that the paradox of the Christian life is that God is at once totally beyond our conceptual mastery, but yet as close as even the most simple physical reality. And Ellacuria was deeply moved by that, and this idea of finding the mystery of God present in one's own life. So there is a kind of a connection between the two.
Matt, thank you very much. That was a wonderful and stimulating and eloquent kind of unpacking of the connections between the exercises and these two folks who are so important in the 20th century. I want to follow up on Dave's comment and in some ways come back to that question. that our novice posed. In so many ways, underlying the presentation you offer, you help us to realize the exercises not only change the imagination, but they change our way of knowing and help us move from a very dualistic way of relating to our experience and to the world to this non-dual way of seeing, so that simultaneously God is immanent and transcendent. We are simultaneously sinners and beloved by God. Nature and grace are, in a sense, inextricably interwoven, and although we can make them distinct, they can't be separated. There's something about how the conversion that the exercises produce in the head and the heart is a transformation of our way of experiencing and engaging the world in that way, helping us to move beyond these false dichotomies. And in a sense, coming back to that question about the mission and identity of a Jesuit or a Catholic college, if we continue to see in those dualistic categories, it's very hard to escape this kind of distinction that ends up as a separation. Arts and sciences, and they do their thing, business does its thing, you know.
Campus ministries over here.
Yeah, that kind of decomposition, you know, of the way that we do what we do. But I think what I'm really taking away from tonight's presentation is how to hold that non-dual perspective, that kind of loving and deeply intellectually inquiring kind of embrace of reality is a grace, and it's one that's somehow the fruit of a practice that the exercises presents to us. So I'm very grateful to you for that.
Yeah, I myself think it's the power of gratitude, and Gustavo Gutierrez teaches on our faculty at Notre Dame, and he has a little saying about if you're doing something out of obligation, there's always a limit. Quid pro quo. You did this much for me, okay, I'll just do this much for you. Whereas Gustavo says there is no limit to what gratitude can bring you to do, and for Gustavo, he's a Dominican now, so we argue a lot about this, but he thinks that that this is the core of becoming poor in spirit for him, or what he calls spiritual childhood, is the childhood at its best, which is just this sense of wonder and gratitude for just the incredible gift that every day is, that unfortunately we kind of lose at some point in growing up. And for Gustavo, that's he sees that as the underlying energy, even to a commitment to justice, because he'll say that even a commitment to justice can become an idolatry. And so the way he puts it, which I tell him is very Jesuit, but we have arguments about this, right? So is that what he calls the language of contemplation, which is the language of just being overwhelmed by gratitude for the gift, the absolute gift that life is, that overcomes our tendency to make calculations and figure out that's the sort of spiritual energy, which then leads us to give and to enter into a work for a world that's more human. And I think there's a beautiful essay by Karl Rahner on sort of finding God in the everyday, and he actually he uses the German Alltaglich, which it means every day, but it kind of means the daily grind. That Philip Indeen, who's a wonderful translator of Rahner, uses it. Finding God, the grind of the everyday. And Rahner points out, even for a Carthusian monk doing religious things, it's still the grind of the everyday. But he said, but if gratitude entered into that, then it's transformed into a place of finding God. And he uses, almost unconsciously, I think, in this essay, he says, in fact, just grace and love of God is enough. And of course, that's the end of the prayer at the Contemplatio, right? Give me only love for you and your grace, and that's enough for me. And so that's my own, what I've, if I were to try and boil it down, it's just that getting people to have an immense sense of the wonder and the gratitude, which just sort of takes us by surprise. And at least for me, when I was studying astronomy and physics, that's what the world that science did for me. It just gave me this sense of what an amazing world we live in. And I think that's what Rahner meant, that all the different kind of studies of the university, if they surprise us and they bring us just to a sense of wonder and gratitude, that is completely coherent with the movement of the exercises.
Let's say a word, though, about Gustavo Gutierrez to a general audience.
Oh, Gustavo Gutierrez is a Peruvian theologian who sometimes is called the father of liberation theology, who for the last 10 years spends his falls. He's a smart guy, too. He spends the fall in South Bend, but he goes to Peru in January. So South Bend, Peru, January. It's not rocket science. But he's written a number of beautiful books on spirituality and on theology. And as I tell him, it's very good, but he was influenced by some very important Dominican theologians in France in the 50s. And so he's a Dominican.
Please.
I have a question. Most of my higher education has been very secular. I went to Catholic high school, Christian Brothers, and then after that to secular institutions. And I find the ethos here at Moyne, I'm an adjunct now, to be fantastic. It's kind of popping all kinds of ideas. How do you, however, talk? This seems to me that today's discussion was really about the Catholic university or Catholic college. Mm-hmm. How do you, as a top level, or any top level, or at the highest level of Catholic universities, discuss with or talk to the very top secular universities? Is there something that overlaps, a commonality, and is there a language that you can find between yourselves to do some of these things, or is that holding back, perhaps, the Catholic institutions because of some built-in hostility?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I can tell you about is my dealings with, sort of non-Catholic, even non-religious faculty at Notre Dame, because I work on an initiative at Notre Dame to look at issues of sustainability and environmental ethics and so on. And the person, there were actually 4 or 5 of us who put it together, and the one, really the driving energy behind it all is a biologist who is not, I think if you go back a little ways, parents, grandparents are Jewish, but she doesn't see that, and the kind of language that we use together, I think, is this basics thing sense, at least where I start with her and where we talk, is that what we do really matters. I don't know how secular institutions try and make sense, and there are a lot of pressures on universities, as you well know, and particularly the liberal arts, that they're not productive, they don't contribute, and if you look at different secular universities, they have different ways of trying to deal with that. So in a certain sense, I wish them well to try and figure that out. Yeah. But I do think that within the Notre Dame as a Catholic university, the starting point for the conversation is, what is it that makes this matter to you? And I think that then provides a place where, even if we don't share that specific language for articulating why it matters, there's a deep kinship of that it matters. And I don't want to speak for my non-Catholic colleagues at Notre Dame, but I think some people who like it there, they like it there because of that sense that things matter, and also that you can have a very, actually one of the, this is getting a little far afield, but one of the best people that for me ever gave an articulation of a Catholic university was a Jewish faculty member in the engineering department, where he said that in our world today, in which religion isn't going away, if we can give a witness that you can have a deeply passionate religious conviction and also reach out and be involved in a broader secular world, what greater gift can that be in terms of the way religion ends up dividing people? So that was my Jewish colleague at Notre Dame. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
I'm still trying to wrap my brain around the concept, the fact that you mentioned that Karl Rahner was trying to re-energize or refound a university after World War II. And then Ignacio Ellacuria was involved in during, and his colleagues were involved with during the El Salvador Civil War, and I'm just trying to wrap my brain around the concept that, he was a community response. A university is a community, and we as a community, we're all wounded people, not just those who have gone through the exercises, but we're all wounded people, and I'm just trying to reflect. I'm not sure whether what I'm saying is a question or not. It's just a question of the woundedness and being open to that woundedness and realizing that it's very hard to feel hope and feel gratitude. You can get there, but it's difficult for a lot of people.
Well, I'm glad it wasn't a question. I mean, it's a comment that I agree with. And I think, on the one hand, another Jesuit who's still alive, fortunately, John Sobrino, I was on a panel with him once. He said, please don't idealize our university. We had huge fights and arguments. And he said, we probably failed as much as we succeeded. So that was Sobrino saying, we had a vision, we did the best we could do, and the university was persecuted because of it. It was bombed. And Ellacuria himself was trying to walk a very fine line because other universities in El Salvador had been shut down. The army had occupied them, and he didn't want to push so far. So, I mean, there were a lot of, very tricky sort of balances to make this happen, and not everyone was happy. But I do think that that they were able to give people a sense of hope in El Salvador, because there was at least one place in the country where you could have a debate that would go on that wouldn't end with someone being shot, and that there was a place in the country where they really were trying to figure out a solution and a way forward. Yeah, institutions are broken and they're finite, and those of us who run them, the same. But I mean, again, I think that's the beauty of the exercises as a set of practices, because there's a very forthright conviction that we are broken people, but that at the end of the day, God works through that brokenness in ways that are really quite amazing.
Please.
Yeah, my question actually kind of deals with that last point and with the slide that's up. How do you know that sorry that it's more theological, but how do you know that it's God who's making himself present, that it's God who's acting and all that?
In this particular context? Well, I think what Ellacuria said was, I mean, remember, this is a part of what he sees as that meditation at the very end. And the way you get it is you develop a sense for how God acts by looking at how Jesus acts. And I mean, so it's a very thickly Christian way of thinking about this. So it's not done in the abstract. Remember, you have those many, actually of the 4 weeks, okay, and they're not 7 days. The second week is the longest one, typically. I don't know, I see some nodding heads over there. It can go 12, 13 days. But it's a very, being with Jesus as he's what he does. And so, I mean, to put it rather crudely, when you're involved in things that, to put it bluntly, feel like that, then the conviction is that that's God acting, because God revealed the way that God acts in Jesus. But it's not easy, because you've got to spend time with the Jesus of Scriptures. So, I mean, in this particular case, it's the way that you know that it's God that is acting is because what's going on is what you have personally come into contact with by these meditations on the life of Jesus.
Thank you.
Yeah, one of the key activities of a Catholic university and a Jesuit university seems to be what they call cultivating donors, that is, schmoozing with wealthy people or prominent people in hopes that they will donate or leave sizable funds to the institution. And I've always been sort of curious as how that might square with Ignatian notions of indifference to wealth and power and prestige and status, or perhaps from a Trinitarian perspective. What does God think of this kind of activity?
Well, we know, I mean, at least because Ignatius spent most of his time begging, right? I mean, he went around and he begged for stuff.
And he said, pray for your benefactors.
And, you know, again, if you're going to have any kind of an institution, you need resources to make them run. And that means you need to reach out to people and you need to get them excited about what you're doing. And you need to sort of persuade them that this is a vision worth putting some resources behind. You know, how do you do that and think about, you know, compromises that you might make? I don't know. I'm not a development office person. And like I said, I'm pretty far down the food chain in administration. So I'm like the little baby bird in the nest. I'm one of the ones going like this, looking for more money from the dean. But, you know, I do think that what you need to do is you need to be clear about what your vision is. And you need to be able to convey that vision and get other people excited about it. And those other people will be sinners just like you. And they may have done things in getting their money that you wouldn't approve of. But, you know, we're all sinners together in that regard. The point is to present a vision and see if people will be moved to support it. And I have a lot of regard. I do work with some folks at Notre Dame who do that and try and get people. And I think generally when I meet with people who have money and they're excited about some things that go on at Notre Dame, I mean, it is kind of for me, it's been an inspiring moment. I mean, I felt like these are people who don't have to be excited about this vision, but they are. And they're willing to make, you know, some modest sacrifices for it. So.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Don, I think we will consider you as the last. Don McCrimmon.
Well, thank you for a fascinating presentation. A statement and then a comment. First of all, a little background. I teach at a decidedly secular institution to the east of here, Cazenovia College. And the statement is that thanks to George's help, today I had a visitation with Father Jim Smith and have decided to embark upon his set of spiritual exercises starting in September. I'm having listened to this tonight, I'm very excited about this. I wish I could start tomorrow. But in listening to this and knowing that I'm not of Moyne, you know, I don't work here, but I'm very interested in the institution, particularly as a Jesuit institution. It strikes me as a bit surprising that in order to that this presentation was a special presentation about the foundations of Jesuit spirituality in higher education. And it seems to me that I would have expected that the faculty or the administration would have explained this to the students beforehand, that this wouldn't come as a revelation or as at least news. That's my comment. I don't know that that's a question so much as maybe a challenge to say, hey, maybe there's an opportunity here. Thank you.
Well, I'll take that as a comment and
Yeah, you do wise.
and express ignorance beyond that.
No, Don, that's a very good comment, and I'm kind of new on the Moyne faculty too, so many efforts are made to do what Matt has done this evening with students and faculty. Many efforts are made, but how well they succeed remains to be seen, and how well they're done, you know, considering how well this has been done this evening, remains to be seen. This has been, to my mind, as a Jesuit, okay, simply a marvelous presentation of the integration of Jesuit spirituality with academic pursuits. I think it's absolutely marvelous. And I think we will, at least I will make every effort to see that this gets a wider audience within the Moyne College community, students and faculty. And I think we can do it with Stephen's help on our website and other presentations. Well, I think it remains for me to offer gratitude to Matt for this simply marvelous presentation, to all of us, even Jesuits, who have been living this kind of thing or trying to live it. It's absolutely amazing. So thank Matt for last time. And we do invite you all to some simple refreshments here, but it will give us a time to pause and discuss things as we want. But please join us in the corner of this room back in here for some refreshments. Thank you all for being with us. Absolutely. You made me blush.